You argue that if moral truths are mind independent or objective, then in order to explain why we evolved with a tendency to accept certain views, for instance, that you should give preferential treatment to your children, then there's no reason to suppose that evolution gives us no reason to suppose that these evaluative views are true. And so the question is, okay, granted all that, why does this mean that when we discover these facts about evolution, we should abandon all confidence in our values? So take your Rutherford B. Hayes example. I gather from Wikipedia that he wasn't the 20th president. He was actually the 19th president. But okay, so I think he was the 20th US president. I can't remember where I learned this. Maybe someone fed me some misinformation as a prank, or maybe I learned it from a reliable history teacher. And suppose I also discover that many of my friends believe this as well, but when I ask them, they can't remember where they learned it either. Okay, so now this is supposed to be the analog of evolution. Now someone tells me that some eccentric, malign billionaire has paid assassins to kill people who don't accept that Hayes was the 20th president. So that's sort of artificial selection rather than natural selection against the view that Hayes wasn't the 20th president. So there's now some kind of explanation of why it is that when I ask around, I can only find people who believe that Hayes was the 20th president. Right. But presumably, if I were to discover that just leaves me no wiser on the question of whether, my belief is true or not. I have no special reason to give up my belief. For all I know, maybe I did learn it, and my friends learned it as well, from a reliable history teacher at school. So what's the difference, if any, between that case and the case of moral belief? Good.
Yeah, I like the example. And so,
well, it is actually adapted from an old example, you may remember. It's adapted from an old example by your ex-colleague, Roger White.
Oh, right. Yes. Yeah. Okay, good. Right. Yeah. Who's your colleague now?
Yes, indeed.
Yes. So I guess what I want to say about the example, as you've described it, is it does seem a bit under-described to me, and depending on how we understand it, I think it's disanalogous, or if we really build it up to be analogous to the case of natural selection, then it should undermine your belief about Hayes. So what I'm thinking is, the way you described it just now, it sounds a bit, so I learned that there's this evil billionaire who's been at work and has been killing anybody who doesn't think Hayes was the 20th president. And I have a similar intuition that if that's sort of all you have learned, then that doesn't necessarily suggest you should immediately abandon your belief that Hayes was the 20th president, because like you say, for all you know, as you set up the example, you and your friends don't really know how you ended up with this belief, but sort of for all you know, it could well have its origins in your high school history teacher. And I find it a bit unclear. It's not like you have great grounds at that point for believing Hayes was the 20th president, but I still agree that it doesn't just make you think, I've got to give this up. What I think would be more analogous would be a case in which you learned more about the situation, which is in the genealogy. And the genealogy, sort of the fuller genealogy, turned out to be something like this. 10 years ago, in the population, people held all different kinds of views about which president Hayes was, and 10% thought he, or like 1 through 45 or whatever, like they held all kinds of different views, and nobody even really knew where they'd gotten them. And then this evil billionaire comes and kills off all but the ones who believe he was the 20th president. And you can imagine naively, like suppose you hadn't known this history and you'd just been interacting with some others who all agreed, maybe the matter hadn't come up at first. and you thought, oh yeah, people seem to think he was the 20th president. I do too. Maybe it came from somewhere reliable, like a reliable source, such as my teacher. But if you learn that further story, which I think that would be the analogy, which is that the evolutionary picture would suggest that a bunch of sort of evaluative possibilities, so to speak, might have been tossed up, and then in a sort of random way that you don't have reason to believe would itself be tracking the truth about this. And then one general type of tendency, like to care about your offspring rather than not, is selected for in this way that has
Right.
nothing to do with truth.